so you should not hesitate to interrupt me or add on if I'm overstepping something. Are they here? Yeah, it is. I will get, email my.
And I heard, she told us the rules, and it's like our data was I know, I will totally take it. But I have to decide, so I expect Phil's gonna come up and stand next to me.
I will.
I know.
So when you see me stand up, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'll be right here to give you a chance.
Yeah, I know. So weird.
Newsflash, the IT is working. It's not going to take you a full 5 minutes. So we're ahead of big email. Hi, nice to meet you. I know. I'm more upset just like basically right here.
Good afternoon. Let's try that again. Good afternoon. Is anybody there? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Oops. So I'm Bill Dietz. I'm the chair of the Redstone Global Center for Prevention and Wellness. My bio sketch is in your handout, as are the bio sketches for all the other speakers. So I'm only, when I introduce them, I'm only going to introduce their title. But welcome to the third symposium on this discussion of surrounding sugar and sweetener consumption. And I want to begin by thanking the funding sources as well as the administrative support that has been delivered here, with a special thanks to Allison, who has been a tireless organizer of these symposium. So our goal is here. We wanted to provide a neutral forum for discussing and critically evaluating approaches to lowering added sugar intake in a manner that facilitates representation of a range of diverse stakeholder perspectives. So we've tried to have a mix of both academics and people from the food industry throughout this discussion. You're here for the third seminar. The first two have already been held, the proposed policies for reducing sugar intake on a population level and whether those are viable. And secondly, why is reducing sugar intake so difficult? And today we're going to talk about, are sugar alternatives and novel ingredients viable options for reducing sugar? So by way of background, low-calorie sweeteners have been increasing across the population. In this slide on the left, you see children and children who are consuming all low-calorie sweeteners. And on the right are the distribution of those calories, those products in beverages. And you can see that there have been very substantial increases in both children and adults. Almost triple in children from all low-calorie sweeteners, both in the food supply and also from beverages, although the major contribution was from beverages. Less dramatic increases on the adult side, although you can see that 40% of adults have been consuming these low-calorie sweeteners. And part of the challenge with low-calorie sweeteners is their ubiquity. They're everywhere. These are just a sample of products, some of which I think are surprising. I mean, why are low-calorie sweeteners in popcorn, for example, or English muffins? But I think this is part of the problem, that some of these low-calorie sweeteners have a readily identifiable source, as in sodas, and others are not as apparent. And certainly as the added sugar in the diet decreases, the likelihood is that these low-calorie sweeteners will increase. So the two questions that we want to address today are non-nutritive sweeteners helpful or harmful? And are novel sweeteners a plausible solution, and particularly a plausible solution for obesity? This is the format. Each speaker will have 15 minutes. My background is Austro-Hungarian, and I think trains should run on time, as should symposia. And I will be pretty rigorous in that. And I've told the speakers that I'm going to embarrass them if they go over by too many seconds. But in any case, each speaker will have 15 minutes. We'll have a 10-minute break to gather questions, and then we'll return for a panel discussion, and the second group of speakers will follow that. The ground rules are these, that questions and answers are saved for the panel discussion. I'll show you the website in which to enter these questions in a moment, because we do have webinar attendees. These symposium seminars are subject to the Chatham House rule, which is anonymity to encourage openness. In other words, people can't be quoted, and that we plan to publish these proceedings without attribution of comments to specific individuals. So here is the website. If you go to www.pigeon.pigeonhole@.at and enter the passcode sugar, you can enter your question, and those are the questions that we'll try to address during the question and answer period. As I mentioned, everyone's bio is in your handout, and it's my pleasure now to open this by addressing the first question: non-nutritive sweeteners, are they helpful or harmful? And we have two speakers for this. Allison Silvetsky-Meny, who, as I mentioned, is the organizer for this, from the Department of Exercise and Nutrition Sciences here at George Washington University. And the second speaker is Marge Leahy, who's from the ILSI, International Life Sciences Institute. So Allison.
All right, well, thank you, Bill, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I'm glad to see we have representation from various different sectors here in the room. This must not be on the full screen mode here.
Right click.
Okay, full screen, got it. Perfect, okay. So to start, I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. And as Bill had alluded to, we've seen an increase in the consumption of low-calorie sweeteners over time, and these are not only found in beverage products, but also in a variety of foods and packets as well. These products aren't here for any particular reason other than the fact that they contain low-calorie sweeteners. So these products weren't chosen for any reason other than that. But despite this increase in the availability and consumption of low-calorie sweeteners, the recommendations for their consumption remain inconclusive. And so this statement is a few years old, but was from the American Diabetes Association and the American Heart Association, which said that at this time there are insufficient data to determine conclusively whether the use of low-calorie sweeteners to displace caloric sweeteners in beverages and foods reduces added sugars or carbohydrate intake or benefits appetite, energy balance, body weight, or cardiometabolic risk factors. And more recently, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee put forth a similar statement acknowledging the potential unintended consequences of recommending a reduction in added sugars and stating that this may lead to an increase in the consumption of low-calorie sweeteners, but recommended that added sugars be reduced in the diet, but not replaced with low-calorie sweeteners, but rather with healthier options such as water in place of sugar-sweetened beverages. So this has been a topic of considerable controversy. And there was a report, a systematic review published last summer that was very comprehensive, looking at this question of non-nutritive or low-calorie sweeteners and their potential effects on cardiometabolic health. And this review focused on prospective cohort studies, which have long follow-ups, large sample sizes, and follow-up over time, as well as randomized controlled trials, which are, of course, the gold standard. So I'll start with presenting the prospective cohort study literature. And this was straight out of Megan Azad's review published last summer. And what you can see here is that in prospective cohort studies, there is consistently a positive association between the consumption of low-calorie sweeteners and weight gain over time. And to give you an example of a study that got a lot of attention, has been around for several years now, this is data from the San Antonio Heart Study, showing that there is not only an association between consumption of low-calorie sweeteners and higher weight gain, but that there may be a dose response. Again, this is observational data, but showed that compared to those who did not consume beverages with low-calorie sweeteners at baseline, that those that consumed 3 to 10 a week, approximately 1 a day, had a significantly greater increase in BMI over the 7 to 8 year follow-up, and that those who consumed 22 or more per week, about 3 low-calorie sweetened beverages per day, had an even greater increase in BMI over time. And this has also been shown with regard to other outcomes, including diabetes risk. There's been several prospective cohort studies that have demonstrated a positive association between consumption of low-calorie sweeteners and incidence of diabetes over time. And so the question is, what is going on here? How do we explain these epidemiologic findings? I'll get into the intervention studies shortly, and I know Marge is going to focus on this as well, but we see very different findings in the randomized control literature versus in the prospective cohort study literature. So one potential explanation is that this may be due to issues that are inherent to observational study designs, namely reverse causality and residual confounding. And this would mean that it's not that there's a causal effect, but instead people who are already overweight, who already follow a poor diet, or who are already at risk for metabolic disease may choose to consume these low-calorie sweeteners. And although that's certainly a potential and likely contributing explanation, there are also many physiologic mechanisms that have been proposed to explain how low-calorie sweeteners and diet soda may causally contribute to an increase in obesity, diabetes, and other metabolic diseases. And so some of these mechanisms are listed here. I won't have time in the 15 minutes, and especially with Bill's timekeeping, to go into detail. But there have been various mechanisms that have been proposed, which have all received considerable support in cellular and rodent models. I repeat, in cellular and rodent models, not necessarily in humans, but we do have mechanistic evidence showing that low-calorie sweeteners such as sucralose, saccharin, etc., activate sweet taste receptors, which are found not only in the oral cavity, but also throughout the gastrointestinal tract, including in the pancreas, and that in vitro studies, incubation of these cells with sweeteners leads to an increase in insulin release. Also, when you give sucralose alongside a caloric sweetener like glucose, we see an increase in the rate of glucose absorption in rodents. So there is mechanistic evidence to support this, although this has not been demonstrated in humans. Same thing for increased fat accumulation. Cellular studies show that when pre-adipocytes are incubated with low-calorie sweeteners, there's an increase in the expression of adipogenic genes. In rodents, there's been several studies with different sweeteners showing that low-calorie sweeteners alter the gut microbiome, leading to changes in glucose intolerance and alterations in nutrient absorption. There's also been rodent data to support the hypothesis that low-calorie sweeteners may dysregulate the body's expected response to sweetness, where if rodents are given intermittent exposure to low-calorie sweeteners compared to glucose, for example, they gain more weight and develop relative hyperglycemia. And then I'll leave this one for Julie Manella, who will be speaking all about taste in the second part of this. But there's also, it's been hypothesized that because these sweeteners are highly potently sweet but non-caloric, that they may encourage more sweetness in the diet, leading to potentially unfavorable dietary patterns. So again, these mechanisms have been demonstrated in rodent studies and in vitro studies with very limited evidence in humans. And so the question is, how does this translate into the context of human consumption? And as I mentioned earlier, when we look at the randomized control trial literature, we see actually something very much in contrast to what we see in the prospective cohort study literature, which is that in randomized controlled trials, low-calorie sweeteners tend to lead to modest weight loss or less weight gain, and may therefore be a tool for actually encouraging weight loss, at least in the context in which they are used. So how do we explain these discrepant findings? Is it simply that clearly this must be due to reverse causality and residual confounding to explain the observational data? Or might there be some things to consider in study design as well that may offer alternative explanations? So I don't think that any of these are occurring in isolation. Likely these mechanisms are not mutually exclusive, but should be considered when we interpret and try to understand the discrepancies in the prospective cohort study literature compared to the randomized control trials. So we published a paper a couple years ago trying to tease apart some of this discrepancy, focusing on several different factors, one of which was the context in which the randomized control trials are conducted, and part of which involved the participants that are enrolled in these randomized control trials. And so in terms of the study context, I'll give you a few examples, but many of these studies, although not all of them, are conducted in the context of weight loss trials where there's other behavioral support at play. And many of them are comparing people who are given low-calorie sweeteners to those who are consuming sugar, which is certainly valid, but also the question is, what about if people aren't replacing them one-to-one with sugar? What would happen if these were compared to water or some other unsweetened control? So to give you a few examples, this was a very well-done study that was published by a group out of the Netherlands in kids. This study had an 18-month follow-up, and the children who typically consumed sugar-sweetened beverages were randomized to either continue consuming sugar-sweetened beverages or to replace their usual sugar drink with a diet alternative. And what you can see here is that the children randomized to the diet alternative gained less weight. So the kids that were consuming sugar continued to gain weight at a higher rate than the children given the sugar-free beverage, showing that substitution of sugar with sugar-free may be effective. However, there's not a water control. So we don't know what would happen if these children were given nothing, or if these children were given an unsweetened alternative, for example, water. This is another study that had very marked findings in terms of showing that low-calorie sweeteners in this study were more effective than water in terms of promoting weight loss and weight maintenance over time. In this study, as you can see, those given the diet beverages, randomized to diet beverages, lost more weight, and this was sustained relative to water. So in this study, there was in fact a water control, but when looking more closely at the study, those who were enrolled in this trial were already consumers of low-calorie sweeteners. So to be enrolled in the study, they had to already consume low-calorie sweeteners, meaning that those who were in the intervention group just kept consuming low-calorie sweeteners, whereas those in the control group had to stop drinking low-calorie sweeteners and start drinking water. So this certainly shows that in people who consume low-calorie sweeteners, that this may be an effective tool for weight management along with behavioral support. But what this means for those who don't consume low-calorie sweeteners or those who are not in a weight loss trial is still a question. There's also been studies that have not been in the context of weight loss trials. This was a very recent study that was published just earlier this month that examined effects of 12 weeks aspartame consumption in young healthy subjects, and they showed no change in body weight and no change in glycemia or other metabolic outcomes. And glycemia and other metabolic outcomes are often not reported in these weight loss trials, and so this was very encouraging to see that there was no adverse effect on glycemia. However, these were young, healthy subjects, right? So this is certainly encouraging, but would this be the case in people who are already metabolically at risk? So to sum this up, while there's various mechanisms that are at play, there's been various mechanistic studies that have shown evidence for potential metabolic effects of low-calorie sweeteners, there's also a need to consider the study design and look at how these are being consumed in real life. Oftentimes people are not aware of their low-calorie sweetener consumption. Oftentimes they're not actively trying to lose weight and are not receiving the support that we see in the randomized controlled trials that have been conducted. Whereas in contrast, in the randomized controlled trials, people are given very prescriptive advice, often, not always, also are often highly engaged in weight loss. And so again, certainly low-calorie sweeteners may be a tool to promote weight management, but whether this is how they're being used as a one-to-one replacement for sugar or as part of a very prescriptive weight loss plan is not clear, and I would suggest that probably that's not how they're being used based on our epidemiologic data. So one thing to consider moving forward, right, is that certainly there is evidence for the benefits of low-calorie sweeteners in terms of weight loss. There's also some mechanistic evidence that needs to be followed up in humans, looking at glycemia, looking at inflammation, fat accumulation, etc. But in all of these studies, we need to really be considering these other contextual factors that are at play. Is this expecting mother who's consuming these in pregnancy? Is this an infant that's ingesting them via the breast milk? Is this someone who already has diabetes or someone who's normoglycemic? What is someone's weight status currently? Are they already obese? What are their dietary patterns? And why are they using these low-calorie sweeteners? Are they using them because they like the taste or they don't like water? Or are they using them because they want to actively be engaged in a weight management program? So these are things that need to be considered. So to summarize, consumption of low-calorie sweeteners may support weight loss, particularly when used alongside behavioral weight loss support. But longer-term, well-controlled human studies are needed to determine the role of low-calorie sweeteners in weight and health when they're consumed under real-life conditions. And it's particularly important to consider the contextual factors, including the specific low-calorie sweetener, saccharin versus sucralose versus aspartame, why someone is using these sweeteners, and other factors that might be relevant to a specific individual or population. And also, it's important to point out that few human randomized controlled trials have assessed metabolic outcomes beyond body weight, and the few that have primarily evaluated aspartame. So the jury is still out. There's still a lot more that needs to be done. Thank you, and looking forward to the discussion.
So there are two co-sponsors of this series that are interested in physical activity. One is the Redstone Center, the other is the Department of Exercise and Nutrition Science. And one of the things that we've introduced in many of our meetings is a standing ovation after each presentation, which gets you out of your seats and makes the speaker feel good. And I'd like to start that today. So, Marge.
I love that. That's great. Okay, so to go forward. This one? Okay. I'm always AV challenged, so I always need instruction here. First of all, thanks to Allison, which I can barely see over the monitor, and the team for inviting me here today. I think this is a great idea, so thank you very much. And I do want to point out, my affiliation has changed. When Allison invited me, I was with ILSI North America, but now I am not, and I am consulting on my own. And my disclosure is, given the transition time, that travel support has been provided by ILSI North America, the Low Calorie Sweetener Committee, and the viewpoints I'm presenting today are totally my own. Okay, so the agenda. I'm here to talk about benefits, and I want to do the point counterpoint after. So I'm really focusing on the benefits. But 5, I'm going to keep just focusing on these. Provide sweetness with no or low calories. That's pretty obvious. A sweet option for those with diabetes or those who want to manage their added sugars intake. Non-cariogenic. And so those 3 we're going to fly through. And then the next 2 can help with weight management and reduction. And low-calorie sweetener intake correlates with reduced sugar intake and improved diet quality, because there's a lot of speculation regarding what's the effect and single studies. So it's an interesting thing to kind of pull it together. Okay, so we got the first one covered, can provide sweetness with no or low calories. And I think Danielle did a great job last week in addressing that. Sweet option versus sugar. Here, this is really important to think about for those who really want to reduce their sugar intake. And I think, to Bill's point with obesity, certainly this is a place for cutting calories. That's very important. But also those with diabetes, and looking at the data from CDC, 30 million people with diabetes in the US right now, about 10% of the population, but about a third of the population have prediabetes. So those numbers are really staggering to me. So when you think about that and implications here, that's pretty important. And then about 5% of those with diabetes have type 1 diabetes, which is a very different issue, but also very important to consider. So looking at all the information, that's an important part to kind of step back and think about. Okay, so low-calorie sweeteners are not cariogenic. The US and Europe both allow health claims for this point. Pretty obvious. Okay, so benefits. Now we're going to move into the more hotter topic kind of areas on weight management and reduction and sugar intake and diet. So I will say that low-calorie sweeteners can help with weight reduction and weight maintenance. And what's the evidence? And I'm going to review very quickly, given the time, and knowing Bill's sitting there clicking, the recent meta-analysis with focus on the randomized controlled trials. And here, I just want to remind everyone on the hierarchy of research evidence. And systematic reviews are at the top, and I think there are issues. So, you need a high-quality, well-done systematic review, randomized controlled trials, then cohort studies, then case control studies, case series, case reports, editorial expert opinion. Animal studies are certainly important in generating hypotheses, but obviously need to be followed up in human studies. So, I'm going to quickly address really 3 meta-analysis systematic reviews, and one was done by Rogers et al. In 2016. And they looked at, they call it low energy sweetener, consumption affect energy intake and body weight. And they looked at energy intake, body weight. They looked at randomized controlled trials as well as observational trials. And I'm just going to blow through this. So they looked at the effect Of sustained intervention studies, they also did shorter-term interventions, but this is 4 weeks to 40 months on low-calorie sweeteners versus sugar. You can see that there was consumption of low-calorie sweeteners versus sugar led to relatively reduced body weight. 9 studies looked at here with about 1.35 kilograms. Not a great deal of weight, but that's important to think about. Okay, then looking at low-calorie sweeteners versus water on body weight. 3 studies, so many fewer studies to look at here. And I think the hypothesis really of a lot of people was that they would be equivalent because they're both no calories. But there was the finding that consumption of low-calorie sweeteners versus sugar led to a relative reduction in body weight versus water, a small change in body weight through the analysis. And I think to Allison's point, it's important to think about motivations and how people use them and their preferences initially. So conclusions by Rogers et al. Really, I'm going to skip right down to the bottom because I'm afraid of Bill. Overall, the balance of evidence indicates that use of low-energy sweeteners in place of sugar in children and adults leads to reduced energy intake and body weight, and possibly also when compared with water. Okay, another study that was done, another meta-analysis by Miller and Perez was done in 2014, and I think they ended up with 15 RCTs. They looked at RCTs and prospective cohort studies. Again, I'm going to focus on the RCTs, the gold standard. And we'll fly through these again. Effect on body weight for all subjects. It did favor low-calorie sweeteners. We did see an effect. And let's see, by age, you can see many more studies in adults, only 3 in children. But in both cases, it did favor low-calorie sweeteners. Okay. Then low-calorie sweeteners by source. More studies with beverages, which makes sense given the prevalence of use in beverages, found an effect, whereas beverages, foods, and supplements, you can see it was not significant there. Oops. Okay, and then effect on BMI, fat mass, and waist circumference. We see an effect on BMI, fat mass, and waist circumference. So the conclusions from Miller and Perez were that findings from the meta-analysis of 15 RCTs, the gold standard study in medical research, indicate that substituting low-calorie sweeteners for sugar modestly reduces body weight, BMI, fat mass, and waist circumference. Although the mean reduction in body weight was modest, it would not be expected for a single dietary change, that is, the replacement of sugar with low-calorie sweeteners, to cause clinically meaningful weight loss. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Okay, and then Allison had addressed Megan Azad's systematic review and meta-analysis, and as you see, her conclusions differed from these other 2 meta-analyses, and her conclusion was evidence from the RCTs does not clearly support the intended benefits of non-nutritive sweeteners for weight maintenance. And you can see a difference in studies, and I'm borrowing this slide from Peter Rogers, who had presented on different meta-analyses at the conference in Buenos Aires this year, ICN. And the comparators differ, because it's like, why do we see different results? I think that's always something that's challenging when you see different results from different researchers. And the comparators differ, how you segment things can differ. Looking at some of these, water, or if you're getting it by a pill form or whatever, there's a lot of differences. So looking at how these are set up, I think is a really good thing. And just to put in a plug, there's going to be a discussion for this, thanks, Bill, at ASN 2018. So stay tuned, please come. Okay, so why only small benefits seen in intervention studies? This was a great slide, I thought, from Franz Balil. And look at what we're getting with regard to taking calories out. Obviously, the biggest place you're going to see a difference is beverages. You see fruit drinks, certainly you're going to see a difference. But like, look at chocolate, it's minimal difference. I mean, ketchup, big deal. No offense to anybody who makes that. Okay, so now, low-calorie sweetener intake correlates with reduced sugar intake and improved diet quality. I just really started reviewing the literature and really got into that for this presentation. So again, quickly, there's the postulation, does low-calorie sweetener intake drive a wanting of more sweets and therefore more sugars? So let's look at what the evidence says. And I found 2 RCTs that looked at this topic, and both of these found a reduction, certainly, in sugar intake. Let's see, the one study, the choice study with Piernas and Popkins group, there was also a reduction in dessert intake, and in the other one, the group with regard to diet quality, increase their whole grain intake and decrease their trans fat intake. And again, these were secondary findings. It wasn't designed around these. Okay. There's about 5, well, there's 5 plus, I'm going to say, Haynes cohort studies looking at different aspects of the questions. And I think in all of these, what we're seeing, well, Drunowski and Rem really was looking at diet quality. And so they were finding low-calorie consumers had significantly higher SOFA scores, and concluded, they didn't look at sugar per se, but concluded that was where the improvement in the empty calorie part was coming. So it's solid fat and added sugar and alcohol, I think, there. Then I have been a part of some work looking at low-calorie sweeteners, and we did, again, see the reduction in carbs and sugars, both total and added, and there were some differences in diet quality between people who consume water and at different levels of intake versus people consuming low-calorie sweeteners. Okay. Duffy and Popkin, they really looked at diet quality, and what they found that the people who consume non-calorically sweetened beverages, that their beverage patterns, let's see, they consume less energy from beverages than those who consumed one of the other categories. It seems pretty logical. And on it all, they were really one of the few groups finding a difference with coffee and diet beverage consumption was associated with the largest increase in consumption of discretionary food calories. So that's not a good thing. Okay. Other U.S. cohort studies, again, really interesting looking at that, just top line, Hedrick, lower intake added sugar, total sugar, and sugar sweetened beverage. They looked at HEI components, a lot of good things there. And then de Koenig, low-calorie sweetener consumers had better overall dietary quality than non-consumers. But So we'll just fly through that again. Okay, so international cohort studies, a few, these two both had findings, again, lower intakes of sugar, so I'll focus primarily there. And then there were 3 that were cited in a review by Hedrick et al. I haven't looked at the primary studies, so I want to be transparent on that. But their conclusions were with regard to diet quality. A Lebanese study associated with a prudent dietary pattern. Sanchez Village, Spanish, associated with a Mediterranean dietary pattern, and Engeset, Norwegian, that was not a positive, that wasn't associated with the best dietary pattern. It was an alcohol pattern, high intake of alcohol and red meat. However, it's interesting to see low intake of desserts. Okay, so energy intake, I'm not reviewing because it's been reviewed plenty. So, okay, so here we are at our conclusion, so Bill's happy. Generally positive, I think we consistently see in the studies a reduction in sugars intake and generally associated with higher quality diet or dietary pattern. There are some pieces that needs to be teased out more. There's some negative findings, there's some positive findings, but overall, my assessment on balance is positive. So here are the benefits that I've seen. Again, what we addressed, low or no calories, sweetness with low or no calories, a sweet option for those with diabetes, again, really important, or those who want to manage their added sugars intake. I'm really looking forward to hearing Julie talk about sweetness in the diet and inherent want for that. Non-cariogenic can help with weight maintenance and reduction and correlates with reduced sugar intake and generally an improved dietary quality. I'm done. Oh, this was one thing, okay, please. Final thought. I thought this summed it out really, really well. From Rogers' review, Madison Popkin concluded that replacement of sugar by low-energy sweetness has the potential to aid in body weight management, but whether they will be used in this way is uncertain, which seems reasonable from the literature and shifts the issue from are low-energy sweeteners good or bad, and refocuses on the question of how they are best used in practice to help achieve specific public health goals, such as reduction of intakes of free sugars and energy. I thank Bill for letting me get that last one in, because I think it really pulls together what we were talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a 10-minute break. There are light refreshments out in the hall. We'll resume promptly in 10 minutes.
We can put up the slide with the pigeonhole.
Yeah. Yes, so the pigeon, what is it? The pigeonhole will be on the...
So for anyone who's viewing online, you can enter questions with Pigeonhole. Okay.
This.
Yeah, this summer. So I was wondering if that's
Here?
Oh, we have 20 minutes. Okay. Okay, and what is yeah? I just need the laptop with the questions, I guess, or something. Oh yeah, no, I'll go get it from
But I'll give you the same for 5 minutes. No.
Any questions?
So you can move this way and like order. If you this is bigger, then they'll come in like it will with both. So you can choose which tab. Yeah, get sausage. And they'll just keep coming up if you have to refresh it.
Oh, you don't have to.
No. So this tab will show you like who's voting, and this tab will show you the order, and you can just see how you prefer it. You know, and the computer won't shut off and once.
Oh, good. Thank God. I was like, ooh.
Yeah. So should be good. It's
Okay, thank you.
no problem. Let me know.
There are like 8 minutes in this question. Oh yeah, I know. So, he didn't introduce me. Yeah, technically no. Or you could just go up and say the next speaker is, you know. Oh yeah. Oh, sorry. No, that's okay. No, no, no. She's introducing the next speakers. Just name them.
No, that's fine. Because he just comes like third and markets.
Yeah.
So you guys can do that.
She was going to do that.
Yeah, just say like Andrew Owens would be like this first showcase.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have that, and then it's gonna bring you.
Oh, I got it.
I think she wanted the votes to go away. So
No, now I have both, so I'm just like, I have to ask that question. No, it's okay. Wait, do I go back? Maybe it goes. No. I don't know. This way? This way. But it still comes up by vote. Okay. Okay.
I forgot.
it's Q&A.
I don't even.
Moderators.
I'm just like reading off the questions off the list. Hi, I'm Samira.
Oh, very nice to meet you.
It's kind of cold, right? I know it is. It is very cold here. So I'm just
I did
reading.
have some thoughts. If you could even pose a question, then it's fair. Because I just have
I
some
mean, I
thoughts
can-
of where we go. What do we do going forward? And I have some thoughts.
Okay, maybe the conclusion is like, do you
Yeah, and it's good things to, kind of pull a
pull it together? Okay.
So it's kind of like, yeah, I want to have
Yes, I know. Hi.
You look familiar because I was on by well.
Oh, were you? Oh, fine. So, yeah, she got onto the webinar.
So I was gonna go. So stevia ones, Allison said not to do it more. So I'm gonna go with. So I'm gonna go with where is that thing? This one and combine it with my first question and saying can you come? Please comment. What do you think about that? That's what they should, right? Like no one's denying it. I have no idea.
Well, my family was just like,
So I'm just like,
they're going to park. So,
so I was gonna take this one, combine it with this one. Then let's see. Just,
The wetlands, but the fresh ones. So there's no difference.
that is awesome.
We're doing it as a team.
I'm always just curious because, as people
forget stevia. Stevia is going to be spoken about next.
I guess I just
No, I think that was not. I will check on it before I ask you everything. So I'm going to ask, this observational studies, you said showed the negative RCTs don't seem to, and then link it with that, do you see the effects after years? Is that the thing? Then the behavioral mechanism linking low calorie sweeteners with diet quality. What can you comment on those? I think that's a good one. Then yours, is this yours? Yes. Okay. So then I'm going to ask.
Okay, we're going to resume. It's my pleasure to introduce the two moderators of this panel discussion, Uri Colon Ramos, who's in the Department of Global Health here at GW, and Samira Talagakar, who's in the Department of Exercise and Nutrition Sciences at GW. And we have a bunch of questions from people online as well as in the group. So, go ahead.
Thank you for the wonderful presentations. So I guess the first question that has, come online as well as, that I have is, so you provide us a lot of literature showing that observational studies have shown, like negative or adverse health outcomes versus the RCTs that have shown protective or beneficial associations. So do you think this is because the effects of non-nutritive sweeteners take a while? Is it a cumulative effect over several years, and that is why we're seeing this? Or why exactly do we have such, disparate findings in these two study designs?
I can take that question.
You can start.
I'll start with the question, yeah, and then of course you'll have a different perspective, which is the whole point.
Exactly.
So well, first of all, to point out, yes, the observational prospective cohort studies do have a long follow-up. That is a positive part about that study design. However, one thing to clarify is that when we're talking about effects and cumulative effects, I just want to make it very clear we're not talking about toxicity. So if it's in terms of accumulating toxicity that has been resolved, there is no concern or minimal concern, negligible concern regarding any toxic effects of low-calorie sweeteners. So definitely not a cumulative effect in that sense. I'm not sure what the context of the question was, but I would say more so than I think the time frame is certainly a part of it in the studies. That yes, when you're following people for a longer time, diabetes doesn't develop overnight. So certainly that's a very possible explanation, but again, I would go back to sort of the message of my presentation, which is that I think it also depends on how they're used, right? So I think when it comes to discrepancy, some of it has to do with time, but some of it may have to really more so do with the context in which they're used.
And I would like to add, I certainly agree, it comes down to how they're used. And with regard to the RCTs versus observational studies, Maki et al. Did a really nice review on looking at the differences in nutrition studies and looking at RCTs versus observational studies. And a lot of times they're just not predictive of what you see with a randomized controlled trials. And I think there's a lot of challenges with observational studies with regard to really tracking dietary intake, and there's so many residual confounders that it's hard to capture and understand what's going on there. But I think the bottom line is you got to look at the totality of the evidence and then come to, almost some kind of like common sense thinking on these things. And I really that's why I put that quote at the very end about there's good evidence that these sweeteners can be helpful with regard to weight management, but it comes down to how people want to use them.
Thank you for that. So following up on that question and related to a question that was submitted, can the speakers talk more about what we know about how these low-calorie sweeteners are used by maybe different populations, and if we don't know, what kinds of studies would help us understand that?
So in terms of the epidemiologic data, we've done a lot of work with the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey here at GW. And we see, very consistent predictors of low-calorie sweetener intake. So women tend to consume more low-calorie sweeteners. People who are overweight or have obesity tend to consume low-calorie sweeteners more frequently. People who are of higher income, higher education, usually non-Hispanic white, consume more. So that's in terms of who's consuming them, but we see the increases in consumption in every population subgroup. So regardless of demographics, we've seen an increase in consumption. And so in terms of how they're used, so we know that the majority of low-calorie sweetener consumption comes from beverages, but that's also been changing, where we see an increase in consumption of beverages that aren't necessarily diet soda. So beverages like low-calorie fruit juices, sports drinks, lemonades that have low-calorie sweeteners. And also, there's more and more so low-calorie sweeteners in foods, in condiments, in even something, I once got a packet of almonds that had sucralose in them because they were chocolate-coated, right? So they're everywhere in the food supply. And I think part of the problem with the looking at the patterns of consumption has to do with challenges of dietary assessment. And that a lot of people, first of all, don't know that something has low-calorie sweetener. And even if they report the food they had, a lot of the food composition databases aren't even up to the speed to know which sweeteners they are. These products are changing all the time, let alone the quantity or if there's a sweetener present. So I think it's very challenging, but I would say pretty confidently that low-calorie sweeteners are not only consumed in beverages and packets, and there's more and more of a trend to a diversity of products with low-calorie sweeteners in the food supply, and that's something that as researchers we need to keep up to speed with.
And I think globally, I know there was just a paper out recently talking about use in 4 different countries, and I can't recall any more details other than that. But I think that's important to look at because I think we will see real differences in how low-calorie sweeteners are consumed by different populations. So I think that's something to follow up on.
Okay, just to press you a little bit more on that question, how, with all these challenges, do you see us characterizing then this big barrier that you keep talking about of we just don't understand how people use them? So how can we design a study, or how can we know better who's using them and how they're using them with all the challenges and the changes that you both just mentioned?
How do we assess their diets?
I think dietary assessment intakes is really, really challenging, and I think the people at USDA are doing some really great work. Globally, I think it's even more challenging. I think the U.S. is probably, one of the premier groups with regard to things like NHANES studies for intakes, but it's just really challenging. So I think that's an area for more funding and more research. Certainly.
Yeah, I'd also add that there's potential for biomarker studies, and this is something that it's still very much a work in progress in the low-calorie sweetener field. For one reason is because aspartame, for example, which is consumed very commonly, right? It's degraded as soon as it's ingested, so you can't measure aspartame because it's not there. It's degraded into its 2 constituent amino acids. Sucralose is only 10 to 20% absorbed, right? So you can't measure something that's not absorbed. At least not, you can't measure much sucralose in the blood. We've tried to do it in breast milk and have very trace concentrations, same with plasma, same with urine. So I think for some sweeteners like saccharin, like acesulfame potassium, that are absorbed 100% and rapidly excreted in the urine, those could be potential for biomarker studies. But again, those aren't the ones that are the most commonly consumed. So yeah, it's not an easy thing to do.
And I think also it depends on the group consuming the low-calorie sweeteners. I know the National Weight Registry study, a lot of those people, to be in it, I think you had to lose 25 pounds and keep it off for 6 months, something like that. But there have been some studies with regard to motivations for use. So those are interesting, certainly.
Interesting. Thank you.
So there's a question that's been submitted. Can you describe the behavioral mechanisms linking low-calorie sweetener consumption with the diet quality, studies that you talked about? So
I have to say, I'm really fresh into pulling up all of these studies, and I really want to delve into this area because I think it's really, really fascinating, given the fact that there's all these hypotheses of if you ingest more low-calorie sweeteners, you're going to crave more sweetness. And we can see clearly, I think the studies I looked at, and I'm not saying it was a systematic review, and I really think that needs to be done, a high-quality systematic review. But on sugar intake, it was clear it helps reduce sugar intake. I thought on the diet, you have your own conjectures. I was pleased to see that on balance, there were a lot of correlations with higher quality diets, and HEI was one. There are definitely measures where in one study you see, it correlates with higher sodium intake or higher, saturated fat intake. Another study, you don't see that. So that's why it's really important, I think, to lay out the totality of the evidence to look at that.
And I would also add, I think it depends on the comparator. So if you have people who consume low-calorie sweeteners and you're comparing them to everybody else, including people who consume sugar-sweetened beverages, right, then you might see something different than if you looked at sugar-sweetened beverages separately and compared low-calorie sweetener consumers to people who consume water. So some of the studies that have been done have kind of lumped non-low-calorie sweetened beverage consumers together versus low-calorie sweetened beverage consumers, but then are you really what are you comparing, right? Are you comparing people that drink coffee, that drink sugar drinks, that drink alcohol? Who are those non-low-calorie sweetened beverage consumers?
So another question that's come up is, so you talked about the RCT trials that have been looking at low-calorie sweetener consumption with weight loss. So the question is it beneficial for weight loss as well as weight maintenance, or is there a difference, for the two?
I think the studies really primarily done to date, and I'd really want to look at it more closely, but I think they've really focused more on weight loss. There's been some with weight maintenance. And again, I'm focusing on RCTs because I think since there's a number of them in the area of low-calorie sweeteners and weight, that's where I just tend to focus on that top part of the pyramid on hierarchy of evidence.
Yeah, and I would agree with Marge on this one, entirely, which is that if low-calorie sweeteners are used to lower energy intake, and they are done effectively, right, to lower energy intake and maintain a calorie-restricted diet, that yes, low-calorie sweeteners can be effective for weight loss and along the same, logic, weight maintenance. So again, the randomized controlled trials do show, right, that low-calorie sweeteners can be a helpful tool for behavioral weight loss interventions. Again, my position is that this isn't necessarily how they're consumed by the general population, but in people cognitively engaged in weight loss, yes, they can be effective.
There's one question that was submitted. I know Dr. Manella will talk a little bit more about this, but is there any human studies that show that sweet taste promotes increased intake of sweet foods or increased caloric intake?
That's an interesting question. I'll be interested to see Dr. Manella's presentation. But I think the studies that, I reviewed with regard to the correlations with, there were the two RCTs, which clearly showed there wasn't an increase in sugars intake. But the observational studies, the N. Haynes, we're really seeing more of a relationship where if you're consuming low-calorie sweeteners, you actually have less sugar in your diet.
So I think this is a really difficult question to address in adults because adults have already been exposed to so much sweetness, right? People usually aren't sweetness naive when you study adults. I think the more interesting group here to study is either prenatally and into throughout gestation and then postnatally, or infants and very young children. And I know that Dr. Manella is going to talk about this more, but she has data as to other people that when there's, for example, infant formula that has added sweetness, infants will consume more. Right? So if they're consuming more of something sweet, then the same logic would theoretically apply to something that has added sweetness from low-calorie sweeteners. So if infants are consuming more of a sweetened solution than a non-sweet solution, then adding low-calorie sweeteners to the diet at a young age may lead to increases in sweetness and sweetness liking, and therefore potentially dietary patterns that have more sweetness and often tend to have more calories.
Okay, so you mentioned mechanistic studies that have demonstrated those associations with metabolic outcomes or metabolic perturbations were mostly done in animal models and cell cultures. So how does one reconcile this with and relate it to humans? So how does one make that connection?
Go for it.
Yeah, so I mean, as someone that is doing these studies right now, it is not easy and it is not cheap. Right? So it is very, to recruit the people and all of that, of course, that's part of clinical research, but to look at, adipose tissue gene expression, you have to take fat biopsies, right, from healthy people, which also isn't easy to do, right? So I think, there's just a lot of questions that haven't been asked, and I think part of that is just working together to figure out what is the best study design to address these questions, and then securing, obviously, funding to be able to do that, and to look at these in a way that is, a well-controlled, randomized controlled trial that doesn't only look at body weight as the outcome, and maybe doesn't even only look at circulating biomarkers, but to get at gene expression, right, in fat, you have to take a fat biopsy. To look at microbiome, you have to take stool samples, et cetera. So there's a lot of mechanistic studies and molecular studies that still need to be done in humans.
And I think it would be so wonderful if somebody did a paper discussing the translation of animal research into human research and the challenges, because there are so many challenges. And I can tell you from my perspective, back in my days when I worked at Ocean Spray, and we were looking for benefits of, health benefits of cranberries. And so the easiest place to start is looking at animals. But the chance that you're going to see that actually play out in a human is not that great, and I think that's one of the real challenges. It's really, really important to understand mechanisms. Really important to put all the pieces together, but I think like particularly right now with the microbiome, big challenging area, and Allison touched on that a little earlier, and I want to make a plug for NIH, did a really nice workshop that ILSI North America helped support. NIH in conjunction with USDA, and Dave Klurfeld did a phenomenal job in pulling together a number of researchers to discuss best practices in research regarding the effects of diet on the human intestinal microbiome. And it covered the span from, test tube research to animal research to human research. And so I think it's really, really important to look at best practices and to define exactly in animal model research what you're using, and hopefully what the, being, transparent on the limits of the models.
Yeah, and I guess just to add to that, also just the complexity of human behavior. I mean,
Yeah.
this has already been basically been mentioned, and the complexity of the human diet, right? I mean, rat chow is one thing, but the human diet is something totally different. And so I think it's very difficult, but very necessary that we do test these mechanistic findings in humans.
And by the way, I learned from that symposium that rat chow is not just one defined thing. Rat chow changes depending on, with the same manufacturer, depending on price of ingredients and stuff. So it's really, really, really important to define the diets.
So speaking of refining the diets, we're getting a couple of questions about stevia. I just want to tell whoever is asking that we will be talking more about stevia in the second half of the panel. But there are some questions about different kinds of low calorie sweeteners and amounts. What would moderate consumption mean, and the amounts that you would need to intake in order to maintain weight loss, for example. And I think that compounded by all the different types of LCS, and whether you can comment on that.
I'll be glad to start on that one. And I think, first of all, with regard to intakes, the international regulatory bodies do a lot of work on defining safe intakes. And the safe intakes, the population is generally very, well below that, and there's a safety factor of 100 built into that. So I think with regard to that, and then as far as what you need to take as far as weight loss, it's the total diet. It's the total calories. And I think it's really important to look at, from that one slide that Franz Belil had with regard to the different kinds of foods with what you saw as a calorie reduction. It's challenging, and you can't expect these things are going to be silver bullets at all.
Yeah, so I guess two comments where I think I would differ a little bit. One is in terms of the ADIs, or the acceptable daily intake. Those are based on safety studies, right? So those are, we are well below the ADI. I agree with you completely. There is no, except maybe in very young children, there's no concern that we're exceeding the ADI on a population level. But that's for toxicological safety, which is different than metabolic effects, right? So the amounts that are needed for toxicological, concerns are nowhere near where we are. But what we don't know is how much is enough for a child to consume, or whoever to consume, to have maybe a subtle increase in insulin levels, and then how to, over time, consuming every day for weeks, for months, for years, how does that affect circulating insulin levels, fat storage, et cetera, right? So when we talk about metabolism, it's a different question in terms of dose, and I think that's something that we still actually don't really know the answer to. And that's also a problem in a lot of the literature. Some of these studies, including rodent studies that I mentioned, I'll acknowledge, some of them were very high dose that humans would never actually reach. Some of them were at clinically relevant doses. And so I think the dose is very important, especially for metabolic outcomes, in addition to toxicological ones. And then also, as a second kind of counter to Marge's point about calories, is obviously when we're talking about weight loss, calories are critical. But I would also offer that there may be things beyond calories, right? So is it only about calories, or could there also be cardiometabolic effects independent of calories. And so when we look at some of these mechanisms, for example, the microbiome, right, it may, even in a isocaloric comparison, if these low-calorie sweeteners do alter the microbiome in humans, which we don't know, right? But if they do, then it wouldn't necessarily matter if someone has the same calorie intake, but it's what those calories are made up of.
I think that's a good point there, and I think there's just so much to be learned on the microbiome, and I know, with regard to trying to define what is a healthy microbiome, we've got a ways to go.
So I think we just have about 2 minutes, and I was wondering if each of our speakers just could summarize last final thoughts before we went to the next.
Great. Well, I had jotted down a few things because I was reflecting on my flight in here today on where do we go from here, and my wishes going forward. And I think, Allison, you and Christina Rother did a very nice review recently, a narrative review, which identified a lot of the questions that we're discussing today. And I think from my training and how I really like to look at things is laying everything out systematically and looking at the totality of evidence. And I think for each of those questions, identifying what are the questions, what research has been done to date, and do that in a high-quality systematic review fashion, and come back together and look at where do we go from here and what kind of protocols do we put together to really address these questions. And, there's a lot to be done, I think. There's a lot of interesting questions, but where do we stand? And my bottom line, too, comes down to some communication points. And again, I've got friends with diabetes and who read a lot of the popular literature. And, you wonder with how the media runs away with some of like the animal studies and all. Are we doing more harm than good? And we need to focus on talking about the totality of the diet. And just the fear-mongering that happens at times just concerns me. So I'd love to see a way to help improve that.
Yeah, I would echo that there's more work to be done, and also it's about asking the right questions. And so kind of to call attention to an ILSI-funded review, or Future Research Needs Assessment, that was published last June. It outlines, I think, 18 priority areas or 18 priority questions to advance our understanding of the metabolic and health effects of low-calorie sweeteners. And so that was a cross-sector effort as well. And I think just defining what the questions are, how we address them, and then how to move forward is going to be a lot more effective than just running around in circles as individual investigators. And so I would say that for one. And then also, I wouldn't want to discourage something that could be a useful tool. And so I think I agree with your concern about some of the fear-mongering. I understand it is a very polarized field. There's extremes on both sides. And so really, though, to be able to continue to ask questions that need to be answered while not villainizing an ingredient one way or the other. So I think that, again, there's a lot of questions to be asked, particularly early life exposure, which I know Julie is going to talk about. And just really to reiterate that the way that these sweeteners are used has changed in terms of the way the food supply has evolved, and that we need to be able to look at, again, the context of their use, the sources, the different sweeteners, to be able to more definitively answer the question. So I think, again, the jury is still out. These may be effective, but there's a lot more questions that we need to ask and address rigorously.
And I'd like to make a plug that for bringing this together. I think GWU is doing a great job here, and I think, towards the talk on what LC North America had done with regard to the future research needs, that was really a top-level thing. I would love to see a focused prioritization on the questions and really working towards systematic review and bringing back stakeholders to move it forward. And I think you guys could be a great group to convene this.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Standing ovation.
Allison, are you questioning your slides? Right. Okay. So it's my pleasure to introduce the next two speakers, Andrew Ohms from Cargill and Julie Manella from the Manel Chemical Census Center. It's a particular pleasure to introduce Julie because we've grew up together in this field. We were trying to remember, it's been over 20 years since we've worked together and talked about these issues. So thank you both and welcome.
So I don't get hit by the podium. I'm a little taller than everybody else, so hopefully you can hear me. The mic might be a little too short the other way. As you probably read in your packet, I've been with Cargill about 20 years, but the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are mine and do not necessarily represent the policies or positions of Cargill. Also, I'm going to talk about some customers and some products and some other things here. It doesn't necessarily mean they're customers or products that contain Cargill ingredients. They're just to illustrate the market and what's going on. So if you don't know who Cargill is, actually probably most of you may not. It's probably the biggest company nobody knows about, right? It's a privately held company, about 155,000 employees worldwide and operating in 70 countries, speaking 65 different languages. We've been around a long time, about 152 years. And really our goal is to nourish the world. What does that mean? Well, we provide a lot of supply chains and ingredients to consumer packaged good companies globally, shipping, and other things to really bring new ingredients and existing ingredients to market. So the question I'm here to talk about, which is exciting, is novel sweeteners. Are they a plausible solution to help reduce sugar intake at a population level? And I don't like the word novel very much in this case because what I'm talking about are sweeteners that we'll get to here in a bit that have actually been around for as many as 10 years. So we'll say new sweeteners for the rest of the presentation. But our opinion's yes. Two of the sweeteners I'm going to talk about have removed over 2 billion pounds of sugar from the market in the last 5 years. So that's just Cargill selling those ingredients. There's several others that sell those ingredients as well. So we're having an impact. That's over 3 trillion calories. So why novel sweeteners? Why do we need another sweetener? I mean, there's all these things that we can work with. They're both caloric and non-caloric. All these low and no calorie sweeteners are out there. Why do we need something new? Well, first of all, we still have this sugar problem that we talked about and really why this is all put together, right? Our consumption of sugar, especially in the United States, is higher than the recommendations of WHO and SACN. It's come down over time primarily because of low and no calorie sweeteners, but it's still higher than what we all should be eating. So there's still a need. And this is IFIC data, so International Food Information Council information. We ask consumers, what are you trying to avoid in your diet? And 76, it's actually 76 now, we have updated data that came out yesterday, say, yes, I'm trying to limit or avoid sugar. So consumers are aware that I'm eating too much sugar. I need to do something to reduce my sugar intake. And there's a lot of ways to do it. I mean, you can drink water, obviously, rather than a caloric beverage. You can consume smaller portions, but you can also use low and no calorie sweeteners rather than adding sugar. Or rather than sprinkling sugar on your cereal or your fruit in the morning, you use a different sweetener. So this is actually internal Cargill data. So it's not that we don't believe what IFIC does, but we like to understand ourselves as well. So we ask a question of, when you go to the store and buy something and you turn the package around, what are you trying to avoid? And sweeteners were, 3 of the top 6 ingredients. And the last one is artificial sweeteners. So now we see that we need to reduce sugar. We need a sweetener to do it that doesn't have calories, and it can't be one of the artificial ones that are already on the market. So we need something new. If I'm working for a consumer packaged good company, I'm faced with a lot of issues, right? If I'm a formulator trying to put together the next soda, the next water, the next cupcake, whatever you're going to eat, I have these WHO dietary guidelines have come out, and 10% of your sugar intake, nutritional facts panel changes, sugar taxes, consumer behavior is changing. We talked about the media here earlier. It may not all be true, but people are on Facebook. They're on their social media. They get bombarded every day with this is bad, this is good, you should do this, you shouldn't do that. And they're quite frankly confused, but it's led to, I don't want an artificial sweetener. I want a new sweetener. And of course, it still has to taste good. This is, again, IFIC data and asked, what's driving your purchase decisions? It's taste. It's always been taste, and it will always be taste. If it doesn't taste good, no one will buy it. Even if it's healthy for you, You might buy it once, but you're not going to buy it again. Okay, so what is a novel sweetener? What are the new sweeteners I'm going to talk about? There's really three that we can bring up. There's all kinds of sweeteners that aren't on the market yet. These are commercial things in the United States, but they've really come out in the last few years, and we want to focus on those. The first is stevia leaf extract. It comes from a plant native to Latin America. It's about 250 times sweetener than sugar, so it is a high potency sweetener. It's stable, unlike some artificials that aren't stable to heat and other things. This is stable, so you can bake with it. And the sweet parts are called stevioglycosides. So on a label, it shows up as stevia leaf extract for the most part, but if you see stevioglycosides, those are actually the sweet molecules that are found in the leaf, and I'll talk more about those later. The next one's monk fruit extract, also called lohan guo. This comes from this little gourd melon-looking thing that's grown in China. They actually steep it in tea. They've used it in tea for a long time in China to sweeten it. It's relatively new to the US market and doesn't have as wide of global regulatory approval, but that's moving forward. It's, again, about 200 to 250 times sweeter than sugar, and the sweetest parts are called magersides. And the final one's not a high-potency sweetener. It actually falls more in the bulking agent category. So if you're going to take sugar out of something, how do you make back the bulk? We explained how you make back the sweetness. I can make it taste sweet still, but how do I keep that mouthfeel? How do I make a cookie that still looks like a cookie and not just a flat pancake or something? Erythritol is one of the things that can do that. It's about 70% sweet. It's found in grapes and pears and melons naturally, but commercially it's produced through a fermentation. And it really, it's stevia's best friend. It helps with some sensory attributes as well. You usually see them paired together. So what does it take for these things to be successful? How can they actually exist in the market, continue to grow, and replace sugar in diets to help with obesity? It's these three things: taste, cost, and label. At the simplest level, it's these. If it doesn't taste good, no one will buy it. If it costs too much, no one can afford it. And then label, what do we mean by that? It's really about this additional clean label. Are you saying low calorie? Is it the ingredient name? Is it the source, organic, things like this? That has really come into the market in the last 15 to 20 years, which is why we need these new sweeteners. And then there's some table stake things. It has to be safe. Of course it has to be safe. It has to be approved by regulatory. It has to be able to formulate it into beverages and the foods that we eat every day. And then consumer knowledge and perception. This one's a difficult one, right? These are new sweeteners. So who's ever heard of stevia before? That's a good number. We got a young crowd. I like it. If I'd asked that question 10 years ago, I don't know if anybody would have raised their hand, right? Or heard of lohan guo or erythritol. These things are, we have to get out there and educate the consumer to say what they are, and then also educate the science community on the safety and the use and how these occur out in the marketplace. So when stevia launched with Cargill, we actually had a consumer packaged good that you can put in your coffee that launched with it. And part of that was to really bring the consumer along to explain this is what stevia is. And then, of course, a scalable supply chain, and it has to be an ethical supply chain as part of Cargill. So this taste, cost, and label, I'm going to go through the evolution of stevia a little bit because it's the best way to describe how this needs to be successful. So this low purity Reb A, this is Reb A is one of the glycosides for those that aren't really familiar with stevia. This is pre-2007, so you couldn't buy it as a food additive. You could only buy it as a dietary supplement. People were buying it and sweetening with it, but you weren't supposed to do that. Fast forward 2007, 2008, Cargill did the work to get generally recognized as safe approval in the US as a sweetener. And those products were really focused, again, on Reb A. It was the most abundant in the leaf and at the time the best tasting. And these products worked really well in flavored waters and tabletops and other things like that. But as you tried to go deeper and deeper with calorie reduction, you started to get the bad attributes of stevia. So earlier I'd asked who had ever heard of stevia, who's ever tasted stevia? Who likes it? Right? So So initially, we knew that there were some issues. That taste, that top piece of that pyramid, there were some things that we had to do. So we looked into the leaf. There's more than 70 glycosides in that leaf, and we found that by extracting other glycosides, putting them together in a different combination, you can actually make things that taste much better. There's less bitterness, better upfront sweetness, a better temporal profile, and the whole market's moved this way. So if you tasted stevia before and said, I don't like it, try it again. Try new products today because it is not the same stevia as 10 years ago. And then finally, there's other minor glycosides in the leaf that occur at such a low level that it's not really commercially viable to produce them from leaf today. Now, there's agronomy programs with all the major stevia producers to try to get that up, but that's going to take a lot of time. So Cargill's actually developed a fermentation process to produce the same sweetness that occurs in the leaf. And this then addresses that cost issue. So now you have taste and cost and label. Quickly, that's if you hear about Viatech, these are B2B brands, so you probably will never hear them unless you read the food publications, but if you happen to see them come across, that's what they are. So are they successful? This is Innova data. So this just tracks product launches. So how many things containing stevia on the ingredient deck or monk fruit or erythritol are coming out. And you can see the growth in stevia is huge globally. The reason monk fruit's a little bit behind, again, is because it doesn't have regulatory approval as broadly yet. Europe's coming online pretty soon, I believe, which will help bring those numbers up. Again, sugar serves a purpose. You know, you can't make a sugar cookie without a little bit of sugar. You can't have a 0-calorie cookie. We'd love it, but I don't think you can do it. So you have to make back, you know, these functional things, the browning, the moisture retention, the crispiness on the outside, the chewy on the inside, the bulk in beverages. So that's why it's more than just the sweetener, especially when you're talking about high-potency sweeteners. It's these bulking agents, whether it's chicory root fiber, which is also inulin, hydrocolloids, lecithin, et cetera. So it's really more than just the sweetener that you need to think about and keep in your mind when you try to replace to maintain that taste. Again, this is an example of what you can do with different levels of stevia ingredients and kind of moves down that evolution and what you're seeing happen in the marketplace. Coca-Cola just announced in New Zealand they launched 100% sugar-reduced Coke with stevia, 100% stevia. So it's not Coke Life, it's 100% sweetened with stevia. And then, you know, are these new sweeteners just going to be niche-y, right? So these are not every product. This is just an example of a bunch of products that contain stevia, erythritol, or monk fruit, or lo hong guo. And I just want to point out, too, so within their categories, ice cream, Halo Top, and drinks by, those are two of the fastest growing brands in their categories, and both of them contain stevia and erythritol. This Chobani, there's a lot of yogurts. Lo hong guo or monk fruit works really well in dairy applications. So you'll probably see it out in the marketplace, mostly in yogurts and other dairy applications and sometimes as a flavor. So are these a plausible solution? I think absolutely yes, but it has to have taste, it has to have the cost, and it has to have the label. It has to fill a need out in the marketplace. And these three ingredients, while they're the new kids on the block, they're certainly gaining a lot of traction and can really provide another solution to help reduce sugar intake and ultimately obesity. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is it. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you. This has been, I really had a lot of fun preparing this. So just as means of disclosure, I have no conflicts. My funding's from NIH. And obviously, this is the question. And I took a different approach. I'm not talking about novel sweeteners. But my focus is not going to be on the non-nutritive sweetener side, but on sweet taste, because I think that's what's really relevant for modulating behaviors, and my approach is often a pediatric one. And so I'm going to take a developmental approach. So the big reality is many chronic diseases that plague modern society derive in large part from poor food choice that are dictated by our taste preferences. We don't have a broccoli epidemic. We're eating too much sugar and too much salt and fat. And these choices are dictated by our taste preferences. And the other thing that's probably as important is the avoidance of healthy foods where children aren't eating enough fruits and vegetables. And the pattern that's evident in adults is also evident in children. Okay. So there's been changes in the food environment in recent times. Use of added sugars, the discovery of chemicals that you've heard about that impart sweetness with fewer, no calories. And these sweeteners, just like sugar, have a number of functions. It's not just to impart a sweet taste. They provide texture, they mask the bad taste. They're doing a lot of things within a food supply. Many still have the concern that they're empty calories with few beneficial nutrients. And there's consumer confusion. I think the one thing that industry can do is if parents really don't understand the label, what's a natural versus an artificial, non-nutritive sweetener. Allison's work has really shown that. They don't know what it is. But I think when one takes a taste perspective, is with the use of, and I'll call them non-nutritive sweeteners, that the added sugar content of a food no longer gives you an indication of how sweet it is. That's changing. And what's the implications of that? So the bottom line is if you look at, this is some of the FIT studies work, is the dietary patterns from the age of 2. An American is more likely to eat a manufactured sweet than a fruit or vegetable on a given day. And that's beginning earlier than we like and is continuing. And some of Adam's work, the more added sugar in the diet, the poorer the diet quality. This is what U.S. preschoolers are consuming, and the sugar is often coming from snacking, so no one's going to doubt that that's a problem. It's more than double than what's recommended. A lot of these sweetened foods really should be a rare treat. And as you've heard, the intake of non-nutritive sweeteners is the sweetness of the food environment is increasing more and more. So how can we account for these patterns of food choice that seem so antithetical to health, and why is it so difficult to change them? And you heard that during the first 2 talks of this session. Why is it hard to change the diet patterns of adults? And I think that's why many have focused on how do we start early. And so when one takes this perspective of not looking at what the sweetener is, whether it's nutritive or non-nutritive, and one understands the biology of taste, is this biology is really predisposing the child to like sweetness. It's a really elegant biology. But the food environment's changed. So we now see where this mismatch of probably inborn evolutionary driven taste preferences and the current food environment. So think of how this taste system evolved. It was in fluctuating and uncertain environments. The primary challenge was to obtain enough nutrients, avoid poisons. And our taste system, and also other sensory system, really evolved to detect and prefer the once rare calorie and sodium-rich foods and I'm going to focus today on those that taste sweet while rejecting those that are toxic. That is what sweet taste is doing. It is a signal for energy-rich foods. So then there's the other side of it. It's not just that children have a biology, and I hope to convince you of that, that they like sweet, but there's also a detrimental consequences of not being exposed to healthy foods early. So I'm going to give you a little primer on the biology of taste from a developmental perspective. These senses, which I am really fond of studying, are really central to identifying food, which is a basic biological commodity. They help us perceive our chemical world. Taste is not in the taste receptor, it's in the brain. The information begins in the periphery where these sweet tasting ligands bind to these T1Rs, the taste receptors, and then relay signals to the brain. Taste perception is coming from the brain, not the tongue. When we're talking about sweet, we talk about the brain. Tasting something sweet, as you've heard from Nicole Avina, also stimulates dopamine signaling in certain parts of the brain. This is many drugs of abuse are co-opting these brain pathways that were designed for reward and also learning. it's why it tastes good. This is some of Janina Pepino's work. I think some of the most elegant and really looking at how rewarding sweet taste is, looking at striatal dopamine receptor binding and age related to sweet taste, actually relating the two to sweet taste preferences in humans. There's variation, and it's all the brain. But what's probably one of the most exciting discoveries in the field of taste is that these taste receptors, which we call that are in the oral cavity, are ubiquitous throughout the whole body, including, so the T1Rs are the sweet, and it's a dimer of two receptors, and they're located throughout, including the gastrointestinal tract. And that's what a lot of basic researchers, and I don't think there's a hierarchy of science, I think it's a convergence of finding by many different areas, is that there are enteroendocrine cells in the gut that express taste receptors, what we would have named them if we identified them there first instead of the oral cavity. But they act as neural triggers. They can stimulate satiation peptide secreting cells. They trigger metabolic and behavioral responses to maintain energy balance. This is a new science, but that's why there's the focus on taste and also the metabolic effects, as you've heard from Allison. Obviously, there's more research that's needed, but are these non-nutritive sweeteners like sugars metabolically active among children? I think the jury's still out, but this is a really important question. We're not just teaching the brain about the context of what sweet taste should be experienced, but how the body responds to it. So what do we know about children and taste? Some of the earliest work, it's really a century-long legacy of some basic research in children. For hours after birth, the child can distinguish sugars from water. They prefer the more sweet, as evidenced by intake. Even the premature infant will suck stronger to a sweetened nipple than a plain one. So the ability to detect and differentially respond to sweet taste is present even before birth. There are facial expressions. There's a facial relaxation. Often sucking is initiated. You get the Duchenne smile once in a while, but it's phylogenetically well conserved. It's a pleasant taste. And it also, there's Cochrane reviews that just the taste alone blunts expressions of pain. It's a very elegant biology where you see that the child is born preferring the predominant taste quality of human milk, which it needs to survive. There's only one study that has looked at non-nutritive sweeteners in children and babies, and that was to test the hypothesis that that the sweet taste effect on blunting expressions of pain was due to taste per se. And there they used the non-nutritive sweetener, and they've got the same effects on reduction. They used aspartame, same reductions in crying, hand-to-mouth movements, increased mouthing. So the effect on pain was a sweetness effect. Now, when you get to older children, you could do more sophisticated psychophysical tools, and I think with any research, it's got to be, especially with children, is to try to get a convergence of finding, ask them a number of different ways, and just really try to look at their sensory world. There's been several studies that have shown that the most reliable, or the biggest contributor to differences in sweet preferences is age. Children most prefer much higher levels of sweet. Again, it's an elegant biology. During periods of growth, they're attracted to things that taste sweet, which are sources of calories. Just to give you, and it shouldn't be a surprise that the level that adults like is similar to what's found in a carbonated beverage, but when you look at children, you have to add about 7 cubes of sweeteners to get at their bliss point for sweets. So here's the adult, an 8-ounce glass of water. This is what you have to do to get to what children like. And then you see the adult pattern emerging during mid-adolescence. That's when you see it. So you could ask them a different way, and this is just kind of interesting. The lower levels of sweetness, there's no difference. When you see the higher levels, that's where you see children really liking it. This heightened preference for sweet, Nula Bobowski did this in my lab a few years ago, just last year. Also evident from some, but not all, non-nutritive sweeteners, sucralose, aspartame, I don't like stevia as much, but again, these non-nutritive sweeteners aren't always found just in the context of water, but for a basic researcher, we looked at that. And obviously, ACE-K, there's a lot of variation, and that variation was due to one of the bitter taste receptor genes, just showing what had been shown in adults, that the same holds true for children. Children that don't like the taste of it are more likely to have 2 alleles of this bitter receptor gene. So some are going to be accepted by children, but not all. Well, several have shown that when you can measure a biomarker of bone growth, and those children that have higher levels of that, they're going to prefer higher levels of sweet. And this changes during mid-adolescent, which coincides with the cessation of growth. It's a great, it's the role of cuisine. It blocks it masks the bad, just like salt does. And even when the child, it blunts expressions of pain. The more, this is work that Janina did, the more the children like sweet, the higher the pain threshold. But a guiding principle, I think, trying to now talk about this biology of taste, whether it's coming from a nutritive or a non-nutritive sweetener, is the function of the nervous system this is basically what it does, to store information and produce adaptive behaviors that reflect prior experience. And the same holds true with food. During childhood, children learn what to eat, when to eat, how to eat, and how a food should taste. And I think what's really relevant here is how sweet it should taste. We learn to like what we eat. The types of foods that are provided to different countries is going to teach that child that yogurt is supposed to be that sweet or that sour. And I think that the food industry is often now defining the food culture for many children. So there's limited work. Children who are fed sweetened water early tend to have higher sweetened preference later. That's just associational studies. But obviously, sweet taste, just like sugars, are great at conditioning. You can learn to like a flavor that's paired with sweet taste. That's initially, and there's one thing that's always really been intriguing to me is that initially preferred sweet solutions, when you give the animal experience with a higher level of sweet, and I'm talking about intensity of sweet, not concentration here, then the less intense no longer is preferred. And there's some hints that may be going on for children. So this is basically the fundamental basic learning, associative learning. It's the foundation for cultural food preferences. This type of learning is more effective during childhood, and it also can be detrimental. This early familiarization is establishing preferences that guide intake of sweetened food throughout the lifespan. So I would say focus on sweetness. Substituting nutritive with non-nutritive to reduce added sugar is not the answer and may actually contribute to the problem of overconsumption. Now, when we think of sweetness in general, the good news is that the baby's born attracted to the predominant taste quality of mother's milk, sources of calories during growth. They learn to like flavors that are associated with sweet. Sometimes I think it's a one-trial learning. Blunts expressions of pain and blocks the bad adds texture. But I think what the biology says is that children in general, whether it's added sugars, non-nutritive, are very vulnerable to a food environment that's very sweet, with non-nutritive sweeteners or sweeteners added to bread, to foods that typically aren't sweet. You're teaching the child that food should be sweet, and it's providing a familiarization. The other thing not just non-nutritive sweeteners, but refined sugars are relatively new in human evolution. Are they becoming supernormal stimuli? Are they competing with foods that are a natural source of sugars that are less sweet? Are we teaching children that everything should taste sweet? And I think we don't have the answer to that. And as the last speaker, this is the challenge. Is that there's not an acclimation to the less sweet because taste is what matters for the consumer. And that, I understand, is the big pressure that a lot of you are under. But I would say that I think that the parents, especially, who don't want to feed non-nutritive sweeteners should be educated so they know how to avoid it. And I thank you.
Great. So now we have another 10-minute break, which is the time for you all to submit questions. Again, Allison will pull it up on online. We'll reconvene in 10 minutes.
And also, if you guys haven't seen it yet, Cargill provided some samples of a drink that contains some of the sweeteners that were mentioned in Andy's talk. So out there with the refreshments are samples for you to taste.
Ask the question. Ask.
Here,
Okay. I'll write it.
I should be better at technology. I'm curious about I should give around higher standards if they could be for a cause. So basically, the child has the activation threshold is higher than something else. So I never heard that before. So if you get to it, and I can watch the animation. Thank you so much. And you did good. I think that
She's gonna get me right here.
No, I have a thing. But it feels nice to like share. And
Where did you, are you South Hampshire? Okay. Oh, yeah.
I don't think it's very interesting with your questions. Because some of your ones are very specific. I don't understand what compares. Oh, yeah, that's a big one. I just put that in to tie in with your brain. I just need to figure out.
Should I write these down or what? I'm just like,
Oh, because you don't have the computer?
I don't have it.
I sorted it by the latest so we can see them.
Oh, good. 'Cause I'm like, yeah, we just take turns, right?
But I know. I can
can start with your questions. Okay. Like,
I'm not there yet. I just started in January.
oh, okay.
Okay, so wrap it up if you, I mean, you know, when you get to the end of your questions, you might solicit questions from the board.
No?
Allison's in there.
No, because maybe it's something to do with our publishing criteria, right? Like if you are saying that at the start, then we should be consistent and keep it consistent. Okay.
Well, so when you're running the questions.
Right, that's been big.
You guys were so on time last time. Why don't you keep your own time on the clock?
Okay.
We'll make this,
Yeah, I usually do.
It ends at 6, right?
yeah, so.
Are you? I'm not. Yeah, well, it's funny because I was like,
I was like, take some more time.
so it's funny because I was in Boston Tuesday for a meeting and on the street, you know, and so yeah, I was trying to. Are you? If I'm not here, like if I'm not, I'm actually in Boston this Friday because I still have doctoral students. So actually, 2 more defending students. So yeah, but yeah, so I'm gonna be here on Friday. Yeah. Actually here. Which is funny. I know. It's like this weird process. But I actually feel like
Latest, okay.
But then this one will still have the names.
Oh yeah, I don't think I'm not doing the voting.
So that would get better. That's the more recent question.
This is kind of distracting. Because I feel like, I should be looking there and I'm like, okay, well, I'm actually looking.
Well, in the last time people were getting mad that they were like, oh, can we stick with the pigeonhole conversation? That's all.
Like in your retirement to childcare.
He got we can open it? She's okay with that? Okay. Because I was just like, if it's a criteria for her publication, you know, because she. Okay. Yeah, I think I'll ask. Yeah. I'm running. Are you going for 10? Oh, no, yeah. Does he have asthma or something? No. Does he have some kind of allergic reaction to something? Because, you know, it's allergic. Did he eat something? Did he? I know, it's so stressful, right? I don't think, yeah.
Okay, we'd like to reconvene.
So I guess we have to keep time ourselves.
Julie and Andrew, yes. Ready to go? Please take your seats.
It's cold.
Dr. Fernstrom, could you please sit down?
Should have brought my coat. I'm cold normally.
Yeah. As the guy in the suit, I appreciate the cold room.
Yeah.
Usually I'm hot.
But it's just interesting things to think about. That's why I ended with the last slide. I realized the challenges.
Right. And, we're focused on trying to provide the ingredients that give them optionality and make different things.
So we're going to get started.
And then understanding, there's a lot of stuff to understand
Okay.
about this, right? So,
I guess so. The first question that we have is
Wait.
no one's.
So we're gonna get started, everyone.
That's.
I could have yelled, but then they're going to...
So can you tell us if there have been any large clinical studies examining health outcomes with these novel sweeteners?
I don't.
So, for safety?
Yes, not safety, but because we know that they are generally recognized as safe. But what about what we're seeing, what we were talking about in the previous session, metabolic outcomes?
Yeah.
So
and
have there been
microbiome, et cetera.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is emerging science, a complex space to really understand. And, there are a lot of funded studies coming out to help understand not only stevia and monk fruit, what I was talking about earlier, but all low and no calorie sweeteners. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's no definitive answer right now, I think.
Speak into the mic, please.
Oh, sorry.
Say again.
No definitive answer.
Do you want to ask that?
Okay, just give us a second here.
Okay.
Oh, you can take.
Okay, yeah, there. Again, reiterating this question about safety and what do we know about the novel sweeteners. If you could talk a little bit more about what do we know and whether in terms of safety and metabolic. So there's some questions about what metabolically active, I think, means. So if you could also be clear about that. We have some audience questions about what that meant. But whether that should be something that's comprised in the triangle or why it's not when you're thinking about cost, taste.
Yeah, so on the right, I had kind of the table stakes things, which mean these have to be true, and safety was one. So on the safety side, stevia, for example, it's approved globally. There's been in more than 100 countries. There's been more than 200 safety studies to cover it, approved by JECFA. It's the joint, I always forget this, Expert Committee on Food Additives, FDA, EFSA. So around the world, a lot of regulatory bodies have looked at the safety side. Again, on this, the metabolic and microbiome, I think it's an area to better understand, and it's emerging science. And I think you can maybe answer the question on the definition of
Yeah, I don't know of any metabolic studies on stevia.
no.
Has there been any?
There's some in rodents showing potential benefits on glycemia accumulation.
Yeah, I don't know.
So there's, sorry, was there any? There was another question. So you mentioned that children are particularly vulnerable to changes in the food environment, and that given that we don't really know how these nutritive, non-nutritive, these sweeteners, these novel sweeteners, etc., will affect their taste preferences and their learning as as they grow and develop. So how should we, as researchers, scientists, food scientists, policymakers, and parents, kind of bridge this divide? What should we be doing?
Well, I think what children are really vulnerable to is sweetness, no matter what the source of sweetness is. They like it. They've got it's an elegant biology, but there's a little bit of a mismatch now. I think that we don't have a lot of the answers to those questions about whether they're metabolically active in children, whether they're this heightened preferences for sweet, or this sweetened food environment now is, it's always perplexed me. Why, with this elegant biology, is fruit intake so low? And I was reading this article. It was the Leakeys had discovered a pre-hominid called the Nutcracker Man. He's got this big jaw, and he loves nuts, and that's why they nicknamed him Nutcracker Man. And so some anthropologist looked at the dentition of Nutcracker Man, and he did not eat nuts before he died. He ate fruits, and it's the Liam paradox. You may have these adaptations, like we have this strong adaptation to like sweet, especially when we're young, but when the environment has something that's that we're selected for, you could see it. So are these sweeteners, whether it's added sugars, whether it's refined sugars, whether it's non-nutritive sweetener, are they competing with the foods that were typical? And I think we can't think of feeding children separately from families, whether you're thinking of the food markets in which these global markets, what's the level of sweetness in the yogurt you're providing? Is that we all learn to like what we eat. And it's a mystery as to how long, but we all know that food comes to be defined. We learn the context of food. We learn how sweet a cookie should be, how sweet a yogurt could be. And that's what childhood is. When they get to be an adult, if they want to have if they want to have one thing as another. But I think there are too many unknowns for children. And I think this has been a really drastic change, and at least during my career, with nutritive sweeteners being replaced. And I think the jury's still out. And I think at least Allison's work, mothers don't want to feed them to children. I think that was pretty evident. They don't know how to read the labels. So I think let them give them the information and let them decide.
So in line with that question about all of the unknowns that there are and the label, there's some interest, Andy, about how Cargill is thinking about labels and how can the label make a sweetener successful? Is the success coming from Cargill's perspective as a business model, or how are they thinking that the label is going to make the sweetener successful?
Well, it's really what the expectation is from the consumer, right? When you go out to buy a certain product, you have a certain expectation of what it's going to taste like, and the sweetness, and then if there's a claim on the front of pack, so if it's organic or if it's reduced calorie or reduced sugar, and then what's used to do that? Is it an artificial sweetener, which they're safe, they're a great tool that a lot of companies use, or do they want something that comes from a leaf or a little melon from China, right? So that's what we mean by label. It's that extra claim. It's not about safety or regulatory necessarily, but kind of I can feel good about eating this because it's from a leaf versus something else.
So what do you know that we don't know about what consumers do with the labels and how they interact?
I think we're all consumers, so I think we understand, there's label readers and there's non-label readers, right? And I think we get into patterns in what we buy, and it's breaking those patterns a little bit like what you're talking about. You know, we agree that obesity is a problem. You know, and at Cargill, we're trying to provide the ingredients to consumer packaged good companies that let them formulate nutritious, healthy food. And sometimes you have to use caloric sweeteners to do that. And if there's a way to reduce some of the calories from sweetness using a low or no calorie sweetness, that's a way to remove some calories from the diet. So we're looking at that and trying to develop the tools that are necessary, because all these are tools. And it's not just one thing. It's not just sugar, right? I mean, if you don't exercise and you eat a bunch of calories, you're going to gain weight, right? So it's this holistic approach. It's not this one silver bullet that's going to solve anything. Stevia is great. It's not the silver bullet. You have to do more than just that.
Just to press you a little bit more about the labels, because it's an interesting topic, and Allison had talked about how the parents are confused about the labeling. What kinds of information do you guys know about how parents maybe react to the label? How do you try to make the labels in a way that they're more, easy to understand or attractive?
Right. So we don't make labels. I'll make pretty clear on that. Government decides what goes on the ingredient deck and how it goes into that ingredient deck. So that's back a pack, right? When you look at the ingredient deck. So you follow the rules, and we'll always do that, and the consumer packaged good company will do that. It's really the front of pack. You know, what are you looking at the front to change behavior, to draw to your brand, right? So we're not a consumer packaged goods company for the most part. We do have some things like Trevia, the pack and meat business and salt business. But you want to change behavior. You want to find somebody that's trying to lose weight or reduce calories. You might claim lower sugar. If you're trying to change behavior and people don't want to use artificials, you may say no artificials or no aspartame or no sucralose. We see that all the time, right? I don't think you'll see a lot of natural claims in the US because it's not defined, right? Your interpretation of natural is completely different than mine. So at Cargill, we provide the information. This is exactly how it's produced, right? And then let the company that we're selling to decide the claims they choose to make. But I would be surprised if you see a lot of natural claims, because it is a very confusing thing in the marketplace.
Yeah.
And sorry, just to follow up on that, because there was one question about how people could know when stevia, you showed a chart about how stevia has improved in the taste, I believe. And there was a question about how can we know when, especially if there's a table, I think packet, how can they know if it has changed or when there's new?
Yeah, that's tough, because these are, like I said, B2B brands, and the label on the back, if it comes from the leaf, it's going to be stevia leaf extract in the United States anyway. If it comes from the fermentation product, which isn't commercial yet, it's being commercialized, it would show up as stevioglycosides. So it's again so you could delineate that way, but to tell the difference between a high Rev A product and like a Viatech type solution, a combination of glycosides, you won't be able to tell that from the label. It's really from the taste of the product.
Okay, thank you.
So there's a question for Julie. Have you looked at the sweet preferences of adults and children from other countries? Looking at their food environment, maybe is it different depending on?
I just taught the method to someone who did it in Ghana, and the level of sweetness most preferred by children there was identical to Philadelphia. It's every country that has, and I usually show the map. Children of that country will prefer higher levels than adults. So it's been shown several places. Same with we also showed it in Brazil.
Oh, yeah. Do you want to? So there was another question as well. So you mentioned there's an association between pain threshold and high sugar preference, or there's an association for children. So the question was, is there a common neurological pathway to explain this?
The dopamine. I mean, what you see in children, we use the cold pressor test. It was a study that Janina had done. And children can keep their hand in a cold water bath longer if sugar's in their mouth versus water. And what we found is that the higher the sweet preference, the better sugar worked in reducing pain. That's what I meant with that.
Is there an amount of sweetness that is okay in children? Is it limited to natural sources? 10% of added sugars or equivalent sweetness?
What was the question?
whether there's an amount of sweetness that would be okay in children. How
Oh,
do
the
we
higher
define
that, it's like a
Higher.
0.6 molar sucrose, it's high, and then it switches mid-adolescence. It's really high, which is interesting biologically, what, honey, what would they, mother's milk is very, very low in sweetness. It's its predominant taste quality, but it's really quite low. But it invariably, you can do it, 20 years apart, and you still see children preferring like about a 0.6 molar, adults about a 0.3. So it's much higher.
My question, but here's my question.
Uh-huh.
Can I clarify what I wanted to ask?
Oh, sure.
What I want to ask is there a target that kids should be, we should try to achieve for children? We've got the World Health Organization 10% added sugars. I was asking, is it like an equivalent sweetness, or is it something?
Yeah, that's, you
lower,
can't
something-
yeah.
Repeat the question, please.
So is trying to look at based on their sweet preferences, what's an equivalent for how much they should eat? If you fed them what they wanted to eat, it would probably be like 20-30% of calories.
Should we be recommending?
Yeah, I got you. I think
What's a
the
healthy
question is,
level, I think
what
is
what
what
would
she's
be okay for the children to eat? Do we know, in terms of recommendation, for example, 10% of the calories should come
I
from
mean,
added
that's
sugars
what,
with
that's
less
what
sweetness?
American Academy of Pediatrics, WHO said maybe even you get additional benefits if you went down to 5%. I think when one measures the level of sweetness most preferred, that's not saying that's what they should eat. That's just the biology of the child. And that's why it's a challenge. Because and it also is making the food taste better. It's getting, we just don't eat sugar water, but it's taking it's a great masker of bitter taste. So it's making everything taste better for the child. That's why it works in foods for both the child and the adult. I think that it is more of a challenge when we're in a very sweetened environment to get to that level. And you see, it's even worse for children. They're eating much higher amounts of the added sugar than even the adult. What, it's about 14%?
So I guess the question is, should there be a sweetness limit?
I think to me, that's one of the things that was interesting is how does one, when they're buying a manufactured food, know the sweetness? You can't anymore. Because usually when it was a product for children, which usually was really high in added sugar, you knew how sweet it was. Now, because many of these, cereals, they're blends. It's not just, non-nutritive sweeteners. It's also nutritive sweeteners. You have no idea how sweet it's going to be unless you experience it. So how one can, that's a really interesting challenge. If you want to teach the child, we all can think about what we like, what we learned to like when we were young. And, and even some of the basic research like Leanne Birch, you want the child to like plain yogurt and look at cultures around the world that like the sour plain yogurt. That's what you feed. And there comes a point, and this is the mystery of taste, that defines how that food should taste. That's not to say that you might not like it with sugar, but it is not, yogurt shouldn't taste really sweet. And so that's really the mystery of it. So how do we give information about sweetness if you want to provide a lower sweet? I think that these really high sweet foods may be competing with fruits, because you can see that that's always been perplexing to me. So it's a challenge, but the food industry is very innovative. I think that could be a big challenge and part of the education.
Yeah, just to note, there's one odd thing about stevia, unlike other high-potency sweeteners. It actually can't get much sweeter than a 10 SEV, so that probably means not much to people here, but lemon lime soda is like a 12. So you can't actually get as sweet without other tools or putting other sweeteners or other things in. So, if the overall expectation of sweetness came down a little bit, I'd be fine with that.
Let's talk a little bit about the palate and how that gets developed. There's a question about that. You often hear that taste preferences and palates can be shifted over time. Is there research showing how long it may take an individual to achieve this? 3 weeks is a timeline I've heard time and time again.
I mean, the best work that's been done in infants and children, 8 to 10 exposures. The child just tastes the food, and after 8 to 10, they're more accepting of it. It works better when you're younger than you're older. And, you know, I think a lot of, and Bill could really speak to this, a lot of even the obesity work, a lot of the interventions were always focused on older, 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 and then all of a sudden you started seeing the shifting down to younger. And so, and that was based on a lot of the association studies that were really finding that what the amount of diversity in the diet and what the child was eating at 2 was really predicting what they're eating later. And so how do we, you know, and again, I don't think we can feed children separately from families. And so it's that the unit is the family. And I, you know, as we were talking, Bill and I were talking earlier, I think a whole other area to think of, even, you know, I would say even for the food industry to target, is the young adult. They are the future parents of tomorrow. If you can get them to eat better, or to, then that's called sustainability of food habits. And so, you know, we learn to like what we eat. Repeated exposure building on the familiar, and the baby and the child is really faced with a lot of challenges. It's not just to learn the flavors, you know, that they're starting to learn from mom in utero and in breast milk, but then you've got you're increasing texture, you're increasing a whole host of other things. That's all happening during childhood. And so, again, it's repeated exposure building on the familiar. It's the associative learning, the fundamentals of learning that apply to food as well.
So this question is for Andrew. How can you comment on how formulations are designed to match the sweetness of sugar with low-calorie sweeteners versus increasing their sweetness?
Yeah, so it goes back to that expectation. I said a lemon lime soda is about a 12 SEV, right? So when we work with consumer packaged good companies, you know, they do their final formulation, but we'll make things like what you tasted out in the hallway as an example of what you can do, right? We set that level of 12 SEV and then add enough sweetness, because they're called sweetness response curves. So for every ppm of sweetness, you get this much sugar equivalents. So with those, we can then formulate, and then you put flavors in, and it gets even more complicated, but you're trying to match. You're not trying to say, well, boy, I'm gonna put this LNCS in here so I can get to a 16. Because if somebody would drink it, they would say, oh my gosh, that's way too sweet. I'm used to a 12.
Not a child.
Yeah. So
They said, give me more.
it's all about matching. And that's actually one of the hardest things is to match that taste, because there is an expectation. So when you see the most successful things out in the market, they're not necessarily a reformulation of a brand you already know. It's a line extension, or it's a new brand that comes onto the market, because you expect things to taste and feel a certain way in your mouth when you eat them. So.
And just to follow up on that, does that vary by region? I guess we talked a little bit about that.
I mean, we were talking earlier, that's where she mentioned yogurt, because, you know, I travel quite a bit, and, you know, in Europe, it's sour and it's not very sweet. In Brazil, you can hardly eat it. It's so sweet. So, you know, and it's what you grew up with and what you're used to,
learn to like
right?
what
So,
you eat.
You know, when we focus on developing prototypes, you know, we usually think adolescents up. We don't usually think kids, but, you know, it is difficult because everybody has the same pantry. My kids can run out and grab everything, so I have to smack their hand and say, you can't eat that, right? So, you know, it takes everybody kind of working together to develop products that can deliver taste at lower calories, but also realize that there's specialized nutrition throughout life, that whether you're pregnant or you're a child or you're growing, that has to be taken into account, and it's difficult. It's not easy.
And that's really a recent change, is that we make specially prepared foods for children. You know, usually by the age of 2, children were eating what adults of their culture were eating, maybe mash it a little bit, but that has been now a whole market, and that's where you really see added sugar.
I guess one last question for Andy.
Yep.
Can you comment on consumers using stevia leaves themselves versus formulated products like Truvia?
So stevia leaves on their own actually aren't approved for food use. You're not supposed to do that.
Right.
So again, you can buy them at a health food store and do what you want, or grow them in your garden. And what you're just getting the other pieces of the plant along for the ride, right? So there was recently an article in the New York Times actually that said, well, all stevia is synthesized, and I just struggle with her definition of synthesized in that case, because I mean, there's actually been a study. There was a study to analyze whether glycosides were changed as they were extracted from the leaf and through the purification process, which is pretty similar to sugar, actually, sugar refining. And no, they're not. They're the same as the leaf as they are in the final product. So this is what I'm talking about is, people will now see that on Twitter and they're like, oh, stevia is synthesized. Well, no, it's not synthesized, right? It's extracted from a leaf and purified because you don't want to eat chlorophyll and little bits of leaf because it doesn't taste very good. So, and kind of as a final comment, when I think about what we could do with these new sweeteners, and maybe not a perfect world, but boy, if we could redefine what full calorie means, that'd be something. I mean, yeah, there's an expectation of taste, and a can of soda is about 120 calories. What if we redefine that? And a full calorie soda is only 90. You took out 30 calories. You're using a couple different sweeteners to do that, but you're still delivering what the consumer wants. But that's 30 calories of sugar they're no longer eating. And that, I think, could actually have a pretty big impact on obesity. And there's other things we have to do. We have to work out more. We have to change our lifestyles. We have to eat healthier, more fruits and vegetables. You shouldn't be having a 12-pack of soda a day, right? But if you can remove and make those incremental changes and just redefine, there is no mid-cal, because mid-cal doesn't exist. If this is what a full cal expectation is, that would be fantastic.
So I guess that's all we have actually time for. So
That was really
Thank
nice to be part of this with you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. But I forgot to thank you when I started. I thought it was going second, so I was getting closer.
I know, I looked at you like, oh.
Oh, but, appreciate you guys inviting us to this. Oh, no, participating. I think having voices from all the sides is always entertaining.
I've had a long relationship with Cargill.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, when I